member registered for this event, and I think that is an indication of the level of engagement with this issue and with the referendums. I'm extremely grateful to my colleagues on committee who have been part of a subcommittee in relation to on this issue, on the IWLA's approach to these referendums, and that is Rosemary Hayden, who is going to MC this event, Catherine O'Sullivan and Kathy Smith, SC, and Kathy very kindly came back onto the subcommittee, having previously been a committee member, and then they have all given their time so generously, and their expertise and their knowledge and their enthusiasm. So I want to thank them for their support with that. I also want to thank Dr. Catherine Day, Dr. Laura Cahilane, and Eilish Balfe for giving their time this evening. I think we're going to have a really interesting and lively discussion, and I'm very grateful to them for their time. I'm going to hand you over to Rosemary now very shortly, but before I do that, I want to take the opportunity to shamelessly plug membership of the IWLA. I'll leave a link for membership in the chat, but we really encourage you to join. We have many more events planned for the upcoming year, including an event with Monica McWilliams and Ivana Bacik on the 10th of April on Women in Leadership, and we would love if you could join us for that. That'll be at lunchtime, and it'll also be online. So, without any further ado, I will pass you over to Rosemary, who will get started.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Aoife. I'd just like to again reiterate Aoife's welcome to everyone. This is an event that's open to all, and we really feel as the Irish Women Lawyers Association that we have something very valuable to add to this conversation. This pair of referendums on care and family are very much, you know, a live issue. The fact that our interest in this event has been as high or higher than any other event that we've run is a real indicator of the thirst and interest for legitimate and reliable sources of information on these topics. Regarding this topic, as Aoife has mentioned, IWLA has done extensive research on this matter. We have our research listed on our website. We have made submissions to the Citizens Assembly and to the Oireachtas. We have run a number of webinars with Dr. Laura Cahilane, who's here tonight, Dr. Marion McAuliffe, who ran a wonderful series on the history of how we came to have this article. And we have basically tried as much as possible to be honest brokers in terms of lawyers giving the best legal advice that we can possibly bring to this topic. And with that, I'm just going to read you the IWLA's statement on the topic. And the IWLA welcomes the proposal to delete the Article 41.2 of the Constitution. This article has been entirely ineffective in its stated aim, and further has prescribed a role for women which disregards the full range of contributions that women make to Irish society. While we would have preferred the government to adopt the recommendation of the Citizens Assembly to oblige the state to take reasonable measures to support care within the home and wider community, we note that the identification of the valuable contribution carers make to society, together with the removal of the prescribed role for women, are important steps in the right direction. We urge the government to initiate legislation to give financial support to carers, to ensure the acknowledgement of the role of care in the Constitution is no hollow recognition. Regarding the amendment of Article 41.1, we believe the government should publish draft legislation defining durable relationship in advance of the referendum. Failure to define durable relationships will make this right difficult to enforce and will inevitably result in High Court litigation seeking clarity. A definition is also necessary to ensure citizens are aware of what they are voting for or against. Now, I'm just giving you that at the top of the hour, because quite often in a panel we have a debate, but in this panel, all members of the panel are essentially, to an extent, singing from one side of the hymn sheet, but coming at it from very different angles and perspectives. So for that reason, we want to kind of present this in terms of an informative and educational space and a supportive space where people can ask questions and have those questions answered. So to give you an idea of how tonight is going to run, we're going to start with a little few minutes from each of our speakers. And during that time, my colleague, Catherine O'Sullivan, will be managing and monitoring the chat in order to take questions, and those questions will then come to the panel. And then we'll have a conversation, and that conversation will not be recorded. We will have the recording just for the presenters aspect of the session. So with that, I'm going to if I can, hand over to Dr. Catherine Daly, who, as we know, is the chair of the Citizens Assembly on Gender, and obviously has an extensive CV that couldn't possibly be captured in a slide like here. But I'm going to hand over to Dr. Day, and if she might lead us off with her position and her details regarding these referendums.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion this evening, and I want to just try to give you a sense of the discussions in the Citizens' Assembly, what they are asking the government to do, and why they came to those views. It's important, I think, to say that the citizens who volunteered to be part of the Assembly did a huge amount of work on all of our behalf. Because they spent more than 6 months going through very detailed issues. And they made very clear that they want to see a number of significant changes in both the Constitution, policy, legislation, and just the way that Ireland looks on the issue of gender equality. And as you can imagine, most of them were not very familiar with the Constitution. There weren't lawyers. And they were quite surprised to find that the Constitution was not nearly as equal as they thought. For example, I think they were very taken aback to find that the Constitution only offers protection to some kinds of families, in other words, the married family, but not to all other families. And in the case of the so-called woman in the home clause, again, they had a lot of discussion about why was it there? Had it ever been useful? And did it really reflect Ireland of today as opposed to Ireland of 1937? But partly because we met in COVID, but I think more generally because every citizen present had an experience of care, whether it's of giving care or receiving care. They were very keen that the state take on an obligation to provide care in the home and in the wider community as part of the Constitution. So, as I've said, most of them were not lawyers. They were a bit nervous about making proposals, but on the other hand, they wanted to be very clear. They wanted to leave the government and all of us in no doubt as to what they wanted. And so they were very largely helped by a team of lawyers, including Laura Cahilane, who's here this evening, and maybe talk a little bit about that. And they drew in their recommendations on some of the provisions in other constitutions from around the world. Now, we all know, I think, that what the government has proposed is a bit different from what the citizens recommended. It doesn't go as far on care as they would have liked. And the citizens just talked about protecting all families beyond the marital family, whereas the wording that we are going to be voting on the 8th of March refers to durable relationships. So our assembly is over, so I can't now reconvene those citizens and ask them what they think. And I imagine that they would be a bit disappointed that the full extent of their recommendations were not taken on board. But certainly if I was having a discussion with them, I would strongly advise them to vote yes to both proposals, because they do reflect to a large extent what they proposed. And I would say vote yes, and then continue to argue for the rest, continue to argue for the other recommendations, and continue in particular to argue on the issue of care. And I know from the contacts I've had since the government published the wording that most women's organisations have gone through this same reflection of this isn't exactly what we wanted, what should we do, how should we advise our members? And they have almost all come out on the side of saying, yes, let's advocate for a yes vote in both questions, but this will not be the end of the road. there is a further journey to travel to make Ireland the really equal society that the citizens wanted it to be. It's interesting to point out that ours was actually the second Citizens' Assembly to recommend changes along these lines. The very first Citizens' Assembly, which was the Convention on the Constitution in 2013, made largely the same recommendations, and the government took 10 years before it came to the second Citizens' Assembly. So I think it's really time now that the voices of the citizens sitting twice in assemblies be taken seriously. I think, I know some people say, is this just symbolic? Does it really matter? I can tell you that the citizens felt it did matter. What they felt was that our constitution should reflect how we want to be treated as citizens and how we want to be governed. And so for them, it's all about recognising how much Ireland has changed socially since 1937 and taking into account the way that people live now in order to ensure that all citizens get the protection equally that the Constitution offers. So I'll pause there for the moment and be happy to come back further in the course of the evening. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Dr. Day, thank you so much for getting us started with a real kind of sense of grounding the conversation with the citizens of the country, our kind of little snapshot of society that have been so successful at telling, you know, our government where to see people's votes going ahead of time in previous social justice conversations. I'm going to move on next to our next speaker, Dr. Laura Cahilane, who I have a feeling doesn't need an awful lot of introduction here, but Associate Professor of Law in the University of Limerick, and has done a huge amount on this topic, including submissions to the Citizens' Assembly. And I'd like to pass over to Laura at this point to give us her take.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you all here this evening. I was actually here pretty much exactly 2 years ago giving a talk to the IWLA, and I had just finished my dealings with the Citizens' Assembly, and I remember being at that event and being so full of enthusiasm after interacting with the citizens, seeing how enthusiastic they were about making these sorts of reforms, how strongly they believed in the need for the kind of reforms. And I was also really happy with the wording which had been agreed on at that stage. And I believe that recording is still on your website, actually, if anyone does want to go back and look at that evening. I would have gone into a lot of detail on the history and the case law and the provision. But I remember in questions from the audience, a lot of the lawyers here present at the time were very skeptical that anything good would come out of this. But I was really hopeful about this, having gone through the whole Citizen Assembly process. And subsequently, then we had the joint Oireachtas, the All-Party Oireachtas Committee on Gender Equality, which, you know, it's a cross-party body. They considered the recommendations from the Assembly and they endorsed the recommendations that the Assembly had made on constitutional change. And again, that gave me even more hope. And I said, as Catherine mentioned, the Constitutional Convention had also made similar recommendations. And so I felt, you know, after 10 years, we've had the Convention recommendations, the Citizens' Assembly, the Joint Oireachtas Committee, they've all pretty much said the same thing. And I thought, you know, surely that's what we're going to be given now in a referendum. So my reaction to the current situation that we find ourselves in is really intense frustration that we haven't been given what was recommended. And on both accounts, it is quite frustrating that these referendums, they should be slam dunks. They should be really obvious things that everybody wants to support, widening the definition of the family that's recognised and protected in the Constitution, and removing that patronising language, that outdated language in the Constitution, and recognising care more generally. But I guess the way both of these amendments are being phrased has confused a lot of people. Number one, particularly the durable relationships wording, I think has mainly just led to confusion rather than disagreement. And in terms of the care referendum, again, I think there's a huge amount of confusion on this. And particularly in recent days, I think it has become the more controversial of the two proposals, funnily enough, which I really wasn't expecting. And so I might just say one or two things about the care one in particular. And again, I'll be happy to deal with questions on either afterwards if people want to ask these things. But so I've seen a few kind of narratives emerge on social media and in general on this issue. On the one side, you have people arguing that we should vote no because by taking out the current Article 41.2, that we're losing protections, that we're losing recognition of women, that we're losing recognition of mothers, and that somehow there's a loss involved in taking that provision out of the Constitution. But that sort of argument is based on a misunderstanding of what the current provision has done, because in actuality, the current provision has done absolutely nothing for women or for mothers. The only way that provision has ever been used in the courts has been in a very negative way. It's been used to justify discrimination against men. It was used by one judge in one particular case to say that women shouldn't sit on juries because their place was in the home. And if you had them sitting on juries, they'd be taking them away from their duties in the home. And so, you know, there is that language in there. Now, it doesn't say a woman's place is in the home, but it says that a woman has duties, or a mother has duties in the home that she might neglect if she went out to work. So that is not a sentiment that we would like to see in our current constitution, the constitution for 21st century Ireland. And again, as Catherine has mentioned, symbols matter. This provision has had absolutely no benefit for women and no real impact at all. Other than being that sort of a symbolic wording in the Constitution. But symbols matter, and what the Constitution says matters. It matters more generally in terms of reflecting our society, but on a more sort of technical legal level, it matters as well, because the way our Constitution is interpreted, it's what the judges refer to as the doctrine of harmonious interpretation, which means the Constitution is looked at as a whole. So the values in it permeate the entire document, which means that each section of the Constitution is looked at in light of what it says about other things. So it is really important that what we have in our Constitution accurately reflects society as we see it today. So it is really important, I guess, to remember that by taking it out, we're certainly not going to lose anything. On the other side, it's not likely to create any rights or legal obligations either. And that's because of the wording. The current wording that we have says that the state will endeavour to ensure support, which just means that the state has to try. And that's not a legally enforceable obligation. The wording we're being presented with is that the state shall strive to support care. And I think Miss Justice Marie Baker was asked about this last week, and she said that endeavour means to try and strive means to try a little bit harder, which again, you know, people can decide for themselves what exactly that means. But again, it's not a legally enforceable duty on the part of the state. It's not as if you can take the state to court and say they haven't tried. It's something that would be very difficult to pin down. Now, there have been criticisms on the amendment as well in terms of that it only recognises care in the family context. The Citizens' Assembly would have liked to recognise care in the wider context. And also a criticism that's been very much to the fore in recent days is that it hasn't recognised persons with disabilities. And again, that argument is completely understandable. And I know a lot of people are thinking about voting no on that basis. And again, people have to decide. It's a very personal decision as to whether or not you feel that you should do that. But I guess a couple of things to bear in mind on that is, first of all, whether care is the correct context to be looking at disability rights more broadly. So the government has made suggestions that maybe we could look at disability rights more generally, particularly maybe in the context of a reform of our equality law. Maybe that would be a better place to look at reform of disability rights more generally. And the other thing to bear in mind is that voting no as a protest means you're voting to accept the status quo, which means being left with what we currently have. And it might sound you know, that it would be great to vote no as a protest in the hope of getting something better. But the reality is that it never really works out that way. And when we look at past referendums, let's say the Shannon referendum, where people would have voted to look for an improved, reformed Shannon, you know, that was never going to happen either. What this amendment will do, if it passes, is it will get rid of that statement in the Constitution that women, but not men, have duties in the home. That is one thing that it will do, and it will recognise care in the family context more generally. But it's unlikely to have any substantive legal effect either way, so in a positive or a negative. And so that's another thing to bear in mind in relation to rights of persons with disabilities, is this is not something that's going to create concrete supports anyway. These are all things that could be done and should be done through legislation and can be pursued through that avenue. Legislation is where you can really get the concrete benefits and supports that people need. The Constitution is more about putting those kind of higher level values in there. So I think I've probably spoken a little bit too long already, and might just leave it there, but happy to take any questions after.
Really appreciate that, Laura, and I think we could listen, you know, for a lot longer than we have, but we're trying to keep to the time, so really appreciate that. I think you make a very good point on the idea that we're looking at a values document rather than a, you know, concrete, you know, socioeconomic rights document, you know, where it's not where we find those concrete requirements generally. So maybe this isn't the place to be having this conversation, but it is where we are. And there we are. So I'm going to pass now to Eilish Balfe, who is joining us here on behalf of the National Women's Council of Ireland. The National Women's Council of Ireland is the primary group advocating for a yes vote in the referendums. The Irish Women Lawyers Association is part of a broad church of organisations that are member organisations of the National Women's Council of Ireland. But that does not mean that we all think alike or vote alike, and so it's very much a collaboration. Eilish is here coming to us with a huge amount of lived experience as well as the academic experience regarding care. And so I'm going to pass over to Eilish now, and thank you so much for being here to give us this perspective.
Thanks a million. Thanks for having me here. So as you can see, I'm the Care Policy Officer. And before that, I worked in early years for 16 years. So I was delighted when I saw the Citizens' Assembly, you know, advocating for a public model of early years, because it's something that I have done through SIPTU, and now with the National Women's Council, we do have a campaign at the moment to calling for a public model of early years. So I suppose I'm going to agree with Laura, because I've been on the ground canvassing. There's a huge amount of confusion out there regarding the wording, regarding what people are voting or going to vote on. You know, regarding if I vote no, it will come, you know, they'll go off and make it better, and they'll come back with better wording, but they won't. It will be decades before we see this again. And my fear is that, you know, I have a daughter who's 21 and I have another daughter who's 7. And I don't want them to look at me in 20 or 25 years' time and say, you had a chance to remove really sexist wording out of the Constitution and you didn't take it, you know. And I suppose that's what it is, you know, the Article 41.2, it's never done anything to help women. It's just held us back the whole time. And I think inserting care into the Constitution is going to send a very clear message to government. Yes, it didn't go as far as we all wanted. It's only care within the family, but I think if we get a resounding yes, we can go to government, we can go to policymakers then and say the people of Ireland value care, and they, you know, they put care into the Constitution, and it makes my job easier to say now you must support care. And I suppose with my own background, I cared for my dad who had dementia and my sister who had MS. And, you know, there used to be a joke in work that when I blinked, that's when I slept, because I was to the pin of my collar. So I know what it's like to care Did I resent caring for them? No, because they were my family and I loved them. But I did resent when I had to put my sister into a nursing home at 48 because there was no supports out there. So this is why, you know, I'm championing the yes vote personally and through the National Women's Council, because it is our chance to insert care and send a very strong message. I suppose with the family one as well, we have a huge diversity of families now. And as an early years educator for 16 years, I saw every family coming through my doors. And, you know, to have children not recognised in that constitution, you know, it's not something we want to be sending a message to children that, you know, unless you're in a marital family, you're not recognised by the constitution. And, you know, we should embrace those diversity of families. I have a diverse family. I have 2 children from a previous relationship, and then I met somebody else and I have another child now. So we live in this diverse family that isn't recognised by the constitution. So is our life going to change in the morning if we get a yes vote? Not really, because it is a values referendum more so than my life is going to change, but it will be that recognition. And we have 1 million families that aren't under that marital umbrella. So it would be lovely to bring everybody under, especially the lone parents. I was a lone parent myself. I experienced a huge amount of discrimination when I was a lone parent. It probably pushed me to do what I do now and, you know, go back to college and get my level 9 in social policy. So it was actually brilliant because it did that for me. But lots of lone parents live in poverty, and you know, they do face that discrimination all the time. So, you know, again, it's not going to change their lives, but it will stop that hangover we have from, you know, the constitution, from, you know, your life. I know my mom was mortified when I came home, you know, pregnant and I wasn't married. And it all stems from the constitution, because, you know, that's who we look to. We look to that marital family. You know, people will always ask you, are you going to get married? You know, and like it's some sort of, you know, big thing, but actually, you know, there's loads of families out there just living in absolute, you know, happily bliss. But it would be nice to see them under the constitution of that. So yeah, so that's where we stand on the yes. And you know, I think we've a chance on March 8 to really set this country on a new path, to recognise the importance of care, and recognise all those diversity of families. So I really think that we should take this opportunity to vote yes. And I think, you know, I think if we don't take it, I think we will look at this and go, oh my God, what did we do? Because it's not coming back, you know, for I would say decades, this won't come back for. And I feel we'll be stuck in 1937. You know, there was a protest in 1937 of that article going in. So the way I see it is, we want to finish the job that our sister started 87 years ago. Thank you.
Thanks very much for you know, bringing us back to the beginning, Eilish, and bringing us back up to date as well, because you make a very powerful point regarding the acknowledgement of all of our children, and the idea that you know, that the state should be cherishing all of the children of the nation equally, whether through marriage or not within marriage. What I'm going to do now is, as I was saying to you at the start, is we're going to stop our recording in order to make sure that we don't stifle any debate. So for the purpose of the recording, I'll say thank you to all of our speakers, and I'll close the recording now so that we can have a full and frank and useful debate on the issue.